Okay, let's open with the word of prayer. Father, we thank you for this beautiful day. We pray that you'll bless our time together today, and pray that you will help my voice to hold out. In Jesus' name, amen. I do have a bit of a cold. We were traveling last weekend, and when you're locked up with 150 people on a little plane, when we flew to Vancouver, we decided to fly to Seattle because Pam had some Southwest points, so she could go along, and so we flew to Seattle. But to fly from Columbus to Seattle on Southwest, you fly from Columbus to Baltimore, and then you fly nonstop from Baltimore to Seattle. And with a headwind, it was almost 6 hours in a 737. And even the flight attendants I was talking to one of them, and she was complaining about it. But we had a great time last weekend with a group of, I would call them remnant believers in Vancouver, at the Moriel Church for the Churchless conference that we did. I think my talks, I did sort of a talk and an update that's already on our website, but the other talk I did was put up on Moriel TV's website. So I've got a cold, so if I sound like I'm out of breath, it's not that I'm out of breath, it's like I'm trying to finish a sentence before I cough or choke. And so that's where we are. So we're going to talk today about decisions. And just so, in case you're new to what we do here or what I do, is we sort of take a look. I believe we live in the end times. And I believe we live closer and closer to the end times, so that in all of these prophetic scriptures, while I'm reluctant to be 100% dogmatic on it's going to play out exactly this way, as we get closer to the target, as more of these things converge, and they all converge and intersect at the second coming of Jesus Christ, all of these different things that are talked about in Bible prophecy, we'll have a better idea exactly how it will play out. But we certainly see stage setting going on and things being put in place that will come to fruition in that last period of time just before the Lord's return. Now, I don't know how long that will be. I've thought this for a long time in my life, that we're closer and closer to the end, and I'm getting older and older. But the fact of the matter is, I'm certainly sure when I started doing this about 20 years ago, we were close then, we're even closer now. That's one thing I'm certain about. But when I did this 20 years ago, we would talk about things that were going on in the news and the world and culture, and we would usually have a little bit to talk about. Now, I don't have enough time to talk about all the stuff that I see going on. And I know that I usually capture images of newspapers and things on my iPad and send them to a file to put on my computer. And I probably have 200 or 300 pictures of newspapers for this week that I'm not even going to get to in today's talk, because I'm going to try to focus on a couple of issues that I think will affect us. But this is a slide I've been using for years, a world disrupted, and it seems like it really is a world disrupted. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is something that I noticed at the hotel in Canada last week. And as we arrived at the hotel, there was a bus of about, Pam says it was 80. It seemed like about 300,000 Chinese getting off. We were in a very Chinese Oriental neighborhood in Vancouver. It's a very international, diverse city. And all the signs around the hotel, I know there were 4,000 Chinese restaurants around the hotel. But there was a busload of Chinese tourists getting off, and I pulled into the drive-thru there at the hotel, and I said, get up, quick, grab your suitcase, get on that elevator before all those 4-foot-tall people do. And China, it's a different culture. And so when the elevator door, like if you come down from your room to the first floor, the elevator door opens, and all of a sudden there's like 5 Chinese women shoving their way onto the elevator, you can't even get off. And it's just a different way that they do things. But one thing I noticed is a hotel was the National Post of Canada. They had the newspaper, and this was one of the most troubling headlines. Well, you can interpret it a couple ways. Meat is dead. Now, that was the National Post of Canada. Meat is dead. And I had a couple things like that. I hope it is, when I eat it. But, which is one reason why I don't really go for sushi, because I'm not sure it is dead, right? They say that it is, but I'm not sure. And then I'm getting a lot of feedback today. Is it something I'm doing with my mic? Are you hearing that? Okay. Okay, they're working on it. So, but the other thing, though, is that there is a massive push in the world today to get rid of meat. Everybody has the Impossible Burger. Burger King has a vegetarian burger. I don't get that. Okay, in fact, when I was in Canada 2 years ago, I got in a little bit of trouble for it, so that's why I'll repeat it. The title of one of my talk was The Vegangelicals. No milk and no meat. And the milk they're getting is not even skim milk a lot of times. So, but this has, I think, some prophetic implications, because one of the passages we look at a lot is 1 Timothy chapter 4, talking about, some of the things that are going to be going on in the latter times. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly. And listen, when the Spirit speaks expressly, that's a pretty good indication that you ought to pay attention to what the Spirit is saying. So the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times, some shall depart from the faith. Now, that's a controversial topic in evangelicalism, but, my view is if you're not part of the faith, you can't depart from it. It seems to be a requirement for the departing. Giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. So there is a push to get rid of meat. And I see the videos of, little cows, they're being grown for veal and that type of thing. And so there's this big emotional push to get rid of meat. And I think God allowed it. And Paul said, it's going to be one of the indicators of the end time. So when I pick up the National Post of Canada and it says meat is dead, meaning that we're going to get rid of meat, we're going to turn everybody into vegans or vegetarians, I think it's end times, And when I saw that when I got off the elevator for breakfast, I was like, oh, no, is there going to be bacon on the breakfast buffet? Or sausage or anything? And so, I know this is not a very difficult topic, and, it's not a topic of great suffering and persecution, but, I like my meat. Another thing, and I'll talk a little bit about this, one of the things Jesus said that what would happen to believers, and when they bring you into the synagogues and unto magistrates and powers, authorities, take ye no thought how or what thing ye shall answer or what ye shall say, for the Holy Ghost shall teach you in the same hour what ye ought to say. But as I look at the way things are going in terms of how the law is being used, and I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for a long time. It was 2001 when I gave at a church's national conference, I gave a talk on what I saw the coming effects of postmodernism. Now, after that talk, I had a couple pastors of churches come up and say, oh, John, you don't understand postmodernism. This will be a good thing for the church. And I think almost 20 years later, it's sort of like, I think history has sort of shown my concerns to be even more valid than we thought. But one of the things is, as a trial lawyer, as I see people, we used to have trial training seminars, how to be a better trial lawyer, how to present evidence more effectively. And I used to do these, how to use demonstrative evidence and exhibits and that sort of thing, and graphs and charts and pretty maps. And I was doing these seminars 30 years ago about being a more effective trial lawyer, but at some point in my career, it changed. It changed from effectively presenting your case to presenting your case so you appeal to the emotions and feelings of the jury. And so it all became about, how do you get that emotional hook into the jury so they will be persuaded your way, regardless of whether the facts support your case or not. You want them believing your way, feeling your way. And I'm troubled by, I don't want to go to a court that's based on feelings, to be honest with you. I'm an evidence and a facts guy. So this is a concerning thing. Now, here's just some examples of some things that are changing. This is the NBA this week. The great inclusive NBA and professional sports where you can take a knee at the playing of the national anthem. One of the executives of the NBA, of the Houston Rockets, said, "I support the demonstrators in Hong Kong, free Hong Kong." And of course, China immediately cracked down. The NBA is very popular in China. And they started withdrawing contracts and sponsorships of almost close to $1 billion of revenue to the NBA. And so now the NBA has really cracked down on players and coaches and team owners and everything. You can't criticize China. And so what happens is the most restrictive countries that don't have free speech become the ones that control free speech. And so here were some fans, I believe the other night at a Rockets game that had free Hong Kong. And they were told to leave. So they're down there low in the stands. They probably spent, $200-300 for their ticket. And they were asked to leave for that because they held up a sign that said free Hong Kong. So this is something that's concerning. It's not necessarily something we're going to change, but it is something that's concerning that I think Christians need to be prepared for as we see things going. The other night at one of the Democratic debates, they asked one of the empty suits, I wanted to say. Yeah, he is an empty suit. Beto O'Rourke, the guy who pretends to be Hispanic, but his name is O'Rourke, if it makes sense. And he was asked this question. It was the LGBTQ forum. And aren't the Democratic candidates in town this week over at Otterbein? Okay, I'll be sure and put that on my please miss this list. If anybody goes to that, we will cover you in prayer. But here was the LGBTQ forum. You can imagine what was talked. And here was the question Don Lemon asked of Beto.
This is from your LGBTQ plan, and here's what you write. This is a quote. "Freedom of religion is a fundamental right, but it should not be used to discriminate. Do you think religious institutions like colleges, churches, charities, should they lose their tax-exempt status if they oppose same-sex marriage?"
Yes. There can be no reward, no benefit, no tax break for anyone or any institution, any organization in America that denies the full human rights and the full civil rights of every single one of us. And so as president, we're going to make that a priority, and we are going to stop those who are infringing upon the human rights of our fellow Americans.
Congressman, thank you.
Yep.
Now, you understand, see, so what he does is he conflates civil rights with human rights, and he ignores the things that are in the Bill of Rights, like freedom of exercise of religion. I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, what's going on, you need to know, we have a Supreme Court that has a number of people, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Sotomayor, have cited to, and I think Anthony Kennedy did before he left the court, have quoted favorably from constitutions in Europe in support of their rulings on particular cases. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think if President Trump is reelected, invest in cryogenic fluids because they're going to be using that to keep her alive till a Democrat is elected to replace her on the court. That's just my personal opinion. But what they're doing is there is a shift that's taken place. Now, we know the First Amendment to the Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That seems to be pretty clear. But how they're getting around this is they're changing the language. For example, they cite, and this was a decision, this is the European Convention on Human Rights. Now note, this is not civil rights or rights that we have under our Constitution. It's what the EU thinks you should have. And so it says here that you have freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And listen to this. And this is a pretty big deal. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This includes freedom to change his religion or belief and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief or in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. Freedom to manifest one's religion or belief shall be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary for a democratic society in the interest of public safety, for the protection of public order, health, or morals, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. The second part of that takes away freedom of expression. And it'll happen in religion as well. And it does happen in religion, is that you have a right to believe whatever you want, but you don't have a right to actually act on it in any way if it offends us or we think it's not right. This is exactly what Beto O'Rourke was saying, and what I'm sure every other Democratic candidate would say. They're pushing the Equality Act. Joe Biden was here in Columbus early last summer for the human rights event, whatever big event they had. And he said, if I'm elected president, my first priority will be to enact the Equality Act, which will essentially take this type of thinking and try to apply it to the Constitution. This is what I think is coming. And I mentioned this last week in my talk in Canada, but I think it's important. This is a Christian doctor who had a obvious male person come to him in the UK. He refused to call him they, or whatever the person wanted to be called, other than he. And he was fired. And he appealed his decision. There was a decision of the Employment Commission, Employment Tribunal there. And they cited over to the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. And they cited the article that I just read to you. And they said this: irrespective of our determinations above all three heads, belief in Genesis 1:27, lack of belief in transgenderism, and conscious objection to transgenderism in our judgment are incompatible with human dignity and conflict with the fundamental rights of others, specifically here, transgender individuals. And so you see what's happened is that this is how the European human rights code is going to be applied. And if you think it doesn't affect you, here's the rub. It does. It really does affect you. In fact, here's a decision. This is from Epoch Times. A recent decision of the EU court, has said if there's an offensive post, and the case involved an Australian person, politician, and somebody called her a fascist in a Facebook post and a bigot or something like that. And the Austrian court said, Facebook, you have to take it down worldwide. You can't let that up anywhere in the world if you're going to do business in the EU. So what happens is the restrictive things of the EU now are applied worldwide. It's almost like, you would think if that was the case, then a country like China might be able to control what the NBA does. Oh, wait, they do control what the NBA does. You see how it's all kind of tied together. So, and this is from Epic Times. Big digital may be a means by which the oversight and control functions that were formerly the province of national governments have been delegated to the market. And companies are, they're the biggest fascists of all, usually. And here's the New York Times reporting on that article. Here's the cover page of the decision. So what you see is these subtle changes in the language to reinterpret rights and that type of thing. And I think this is all part of this end time scenario. And I think it's a very significant part that we ignore sometimes, even though there's the passage in Luke chapter 12, there's parallel passages in Matthew that talk about, you're going to be brought before magistrates and judges and kings, and you're going to have your rights affected. And I mean, I think that's a prophecy, and I think it's coming true right here. There was a big oral argument in the Supreme Court the other day about LGBT rights on trial. This is the Columbus Dispatch headlines. New York Times, watch out, Supreme Court in session. What are these guys going to do to take away our rights? And the decision, the case was a man who worked in a funeral home. He wanted to dress as a woman, even though he clearly looked like a man. And the funeral home said, no, we can't allow that. We have families come in, they're grieving, and we don't really want them dealing with your issues, which I think is within the rights of an employer to say, it's like Southwest. They all have to wear some sort of a uniform, to be a flight attendant or a pilot on Southwest. But, now we're going to change that because it might offend somebody's feelings as to what they want to do. And so the case involved the law against sex discrimination on the basis of sex. And that was enacted decades ago. And when it was enacted, Congress didn't think that sex meant transgender rights. And Congress can enact any law that they want on discrimination, but what the Obama administration did was they enacted rules to say, well, we think sex means transgender rights, LGBTQ rights. Even though Congress hasn't enacted on it, we're going to make that the way it is. So the Obama administration did that. Now it's being appealed. And, President puts in rules about immigration and that type of thing. And there were 4 decisions this week against him on rules that he put out, trying to deal with the problem. And so what's happening is the courts are doing what they want to do. This is, I think, very prophetic. And it's very troubling. You ought to fear, the person you ought to fear in the justice system the most is a rogue prosecutor. Because whether you're innocent or guilty, they can ruin your life. I mean, we think of the guys down on the lacrosse team at Duke University. And I had a partner who was working with some of those people. I talked to one of the attorneys one night and asked her, she called the office asking a question about something. And I say, hey, is it as bad as it looks in the newspaper, what they're doing to those guys? And she said, no, John, it's much, much worse than you can even imagine. Well, that prosecutor was disbarred, but he ruined, certainly disrupted lives for years. And I don't know if the guys who were accused falsely have been able to get everything back together. And so but I think this is what Christians are going to face in the future. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, there's an interesting thing going on at the Vatican right now. There is a synod, the Amazon Synod, and this is a ceremony. You can see the Pope sitting over there behind that tree, and they brought in a group of indigenous people from the Amazon region of South America, And they had, in front of the Pope, there on the grounds of the Vatican, they had a pagan ceremony. They brought in, and you see them bowing down to an idol. This is the idol they're taking. It's a fertility god that represents Mother Earth. And they took it over to the Pope, and the Pope consecrated it. Now, many years ago, when the Pope went to Israel, I think it was about 2014, I played about a week after he got back, he had Shimon Peres and Mahmoud Abbas come to the Vatican, and they had, for the first time in history, a Muslim imam offered a prayer on the grounds of the Vatican. And it was public. And so now they're bringing in dirt from all these different places. Here is the goddess that the Pope consecrated. And it used to be, there used to be that little tagline when something was obvious, should the Ohio State Buckeyes be rated #1? And the answer was the Pope Catholic? Well, now I don't know that you can say that now, because I'm not sure that the Pope is Catholic. And I've said this a lot. He's a leftist, Marxist, whatever you want to call it. He's steeped in liberation theology from South America. And then a few years ago, I did a video where Kenneth Copeland and Tony Palmer and James and Betty Robeson, and they were using Beth Moore at the time, were like, hey, we ought to all unite, sing Kumbaya and everything with this Pope. That was 5 years ago that I did that video. I think it's Stream of Ecumenism. I think you can find it on YouTube someplace. And so here we now have the Vatican having people bow down to an idol on the grounds of the Vatican. Now, I have my own thoughts about Roman Catholicism. I think they're very clear. I don't think it's true Christianity. But I want to give credit to there were a group of people that had a news conference in Rome, one of whom was Michael Voorhees from Church Militant. And I want you to listen to what he says. Now, he's Catholic. Okay, so pray that he gets the light. But he's one of these people who has some light. So I'm not endorsing everything that Michael Voorhees stands for. This is where you put in the disclaimer and say, by using him, I don't mean that I agree with everything that he said or will say or ever will say in the future, okay? So, but he makes some good points here. I want you to listen to this news conference in response to what the Pope is doing.
Pope Francis has brought such moral and political confusion to the world and the church that he needs to recognize this and resign. The office of the papacy has as its specific aim a demonstration of unity in the church, but not unity in the sense of a majority rules, but a unity, a union, a cohesion of the ancient faith demonstrated in contemporary times, whether those times are the 9th, 16th, or 21st centuries. This almost always, by necessity, means a conflict with worldliness, what theologians have often called the spirit of the age, and to which they add, whoever marries himself to the spirit of the age finds himself a widower in the next. Pope Francis, regardless of his intentions, seems to not recognize his fundamental duty as Pope. The church does not belong to him, as it does not belong to any pope, nation, or political ideology, or any age. The church is ageless, precisely because it is not married to any age. Western civilization was constructed by the Catholic Church following the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. This civilization was predominantly God-centered, not man-centered. It recognized that what man today so freely tosses around as a universal concept of rights have no basis whatsoever if they are not rooted in God and his natural law. The only liberating any authentic theology can accomplish is from an incorrect anthropology of man, an anthropology that enslaves him to purely modernist notions of equality being the same as justice. Whether he realizes it or not, the Holy Father has entangled the church in an anti-God philosophy granting absolution to a political system that has as its primary end the overthrow of the divine, of all that is sacred. The system presents itself for the necessary moment as one rooted in a more complete understanding of God and man's relationship to the world, and this system is wrong. It is not a theological position. It is not a theological system. It is purely political, choosing for the time to use merely theological sounding narrative as its cover. This system is known by various terms and as such is a kind of political chameleon, able to adapt in appearance to whatever registers most favorably in a given survey or the latest poll. Whether it goes by the name of socialism, globalism, liberation theology, environmentalism, or others, it is the same movement, just viewed through a different prism. And at the core is an elevation of man or creation over God, pretending that God, the Creator, is desirous of this.
And listen, that I think, again, pray for him, okay? But I think that will preach. And I've said this many times about the Pope. He's a leftist Marxist, and he wraps himself in religious cloak to kind of fool everybody. And I think this is prophetic. I have no doubt in my mind that this whole system that the Pope is promoting, that you see pushed at the UN through 16-year-old kids and environmentalism and all of this other stuff, is part of what is going to be this end-time religion that is anti-God. Man's going to correct everything. We're going to build the perfect kingdom on earth. It's all kind of wrapped up together. So I applaud Michael Voorhees for the statements that he made. Now, let me just do one little newsy thing, and then I'll get to the Middle East, and we'll wrap up a little bit earlier today than usual, just because I can feel my voice going. You know, what's so interesting about Israel these days is that they continually find things in Israel to confirm aspects of the Bible. Now, this one is not necessarily confirming aspects of the Bible, but it shows that, you know, there were people there, they were storing food and that type of thing. And when they say a metropolis, it was, you know, a town of about 12 or 13,000 people, they think. And it shows sort of how they lived. But there's constantly, all the time, there are things that are confirming the narrative of the Bible. The names of people in Hezekiah's court and scribes and that sort of thing, evidence of them is being discovered all the time. And it really takes a lot of denial to say that the narrative of the Bible is just not true, that it's all made up. So that's interesting. Now, so here's the big news of the week. This is what we'll focus on, because everybody's talking about it, and so I will do the disclaimer at the beginning. I'm sure that everybody will be offended by what I say, but I do think this plays into Bible prophecy to some extent. The president last week, Saturday night, issued a statement about we're going to withdraw our troops from northern Syria. There are still troops in Syria. There are still a couple thousand, and it turns out that what were withdrawn were about 50 soldiers, 50 to 100 soldiers, special forces, that were in northern Syria working with the Kurdish workers' parties, the Kurdish forces, generally the SDF, the Syrian Defense Forces, in the Kurdish region of northeastern Syria. And he said, we're out of here. Now, part of that was in response to some things that Erdogan talked about at the UN a couple weeks ago. He was at the UN and he used the picture of this young boy's body on the beach and talked to the EU and the UN about, we have a refugee problem that we still haven't solved. And Turkey does have a huge refugee problem. They've been hosts for a number of years to a number of around 3.6, 3.7 million refugees from Syria. That's what's currently in Turkey right now. They've, in many cases, moved to the cities, and Erdogan, he likes to remain in power. He's been very clever the way he's constructed himself in power. And listen, I'll short circuit this a little bit. I think Turkey is a very significant player in the end times. Now, is Erdogan the guy? I don't know. He may be a precursor to the guy, but he certainly is a guy who's acting like he wants to be an important guy in the end time scenario with the things that he's doing. He's trying to recreate the Ottoman Empire. And he came up with this plan. He presented it at the UN, and he had a map. That's the yellow area of Syria, and that red line there across the top is about a 20 to 30 mile wide safe zone that he wanted to create. And if you look at the publications of the newspapers that support Erdogan, like Yeni Şafak and Daily Sabah, that sort of put out his party line, for the last several months he's been pushing, look, the U.S. was there, look, we'll work with you on the safe zone, we'll work with you, but we don't want you taking it over, but we'll try to create a buffer zone, we'll work with you. And everyone's like, I don't care what the U.S. says, I don't want to work with you, I want a safe zone in northern Syria so I can take at least 1 or 2 million of these refugees and put them in that safe zone. We'll build villages for them, we'll build hospitals and schools, and it's going to cost about $25 billion that he expects, everybody else to fund. And for some reason, he doesn't want all of these refugees in Turkey because it's causing him political problems, it's causing economic trouble, and he'd like to get rid of them. So he's made some agreements with the EU. They'll pay him certain, billions of dollars to maintain these refugees and not let them continue to immigrate into Europe like we saw a few years ago when Europe was just overrun with refugees, and the political earthquake that caused is still affecting Europe. It's destabilized Europe, in my view. Now, go back a few years. This is a foreign policy article from October of 2016. And what they observed was that in some state-run TV broadcast, and this is right after Erdogan, the coup, whether it was Erdogan designed the coup to take him over or whether it was a real coup, as a result of that, he's been able to purge a lot of civil servants and get his people in place. And he's an Islamist. But what he wants to do is recreate the Ottoman Empire. And so they noticed this map in some of the TV programs that was being pushed. And you can see that there's Turkey, but there's a black line there just above Syria. That's the current Turkish border. But you see that they wanted the border of Turkey to go all down, and you can see there it would include Mosul and Kirkuk, which is the head of that's the Kurdish region. So he was talking about doing that. So when he points to his little map where he wants to have a 30-mile wide safe zone, that's what he's saying now. What he's been saying, though, is as long as 3 years ago, he was saying, I want all the way down to Dar el-Zor and all the way over into Iraq to Mosul and Kirkuk, which is the de facto capital of the Kurdish region in Iraq. And so when he says, and there's reports this week that while he says this publicly, there's also statements that he's made where, we may have to go down to Dar el-Zor to kind of get everything done. And this is Erdogan's way of expanding his empire. Now, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, there's a very interesting article. It's on the autocrats of today's age. It has Xi from China, it has Putin from Russia, and one of the other ones is Erdogan, and the title is The Rise and Rule of Turkey's Islamist Shapeshifter. And I wrote an article for Bill Koenig's newsletter, I don't even remember, it was 4, 5, 6 years ago. And part of it was based on a conversation that Bill and I had at a dinner at a pastor's home in Phoenix area. And it was just Bill and I and Chuck Missler sitting at the table. And I asked Chuck at the time, this is about 10 years ago, I said, Chuck, you've taught about Bible prophecy a lot, you've been influential, you've helped shape a lot of us, but are you excited about this being the end times? And at the time, Chuck just said, well, what I look for, John, is I look for what's happening with Turkey, because I think this is the big deal to me. So I've been watching Turkey. So 5 or 6 years ago, I wrote a thing for Bill Koenig about this guy because he's Islamist. He's a brotherhood. Listen to this. He was born in 1954, 16 years after Ataturk's death, in Istanbul, a neighborhood of open sewers and muddy streets famed for its firefighters, pickpockets, and Romani musicians. The son of a ferry captain, Erdogan made pocket money by selling Turkish bagels when he wasn't studying at a religious school. On his way home, as dusk fell in Istanbul, he would use the deck of a cargo ship anchored in the Golden Horn to practice reciting the Quran, earning plaudits for his oratory. But Erdogan also played soccer, dreamed of a career in sports, and rebelled against patriarchy. His fellow Islamists did not approve of his athletic shorts, and his fathers asked him to land a proper job. And he's done other things. For example, this is an article or things that he's doing right now, in addition to what he wants in his safe zone. This is an article from Israel Hayom. It's the largest circulated newspaper in Israel currently. It's probably because it's free. It's published by the Adelson family, probably at a cost to them of a loss of $40 or so million a year. But there's a big article on Erdogan this week about how he's seating himself and his influence and his brand of Islam in East Jerusalem and causing a lot of trouble for King Abdullah with regard to the Temple Mount. So all of this is to say that Erdogan has a very detailed plan for making himself the Sultan, the Caliphate, reestablishing the Ottoman Empire. But he is a radical Islamist. That is what needs to be kept in mind. So when he's putting out that this is what he wants, I don't know that that's what he wants. So the president said we're going to withdraw our 50 troops. And it's pretty clear now that those 50 troops, or 100, however many there were sufficient to keep Erdogan from going into northern Syria. Once they're pulled back, or we say they're pulling him back, here he comes. Tanks come rolling in, bombs start flying, and he moves into these towns up in Tel Abyad and Ras Al Yan to take them over. This is where he starts. Now, what he's trying to do is this is in part an Arab area. This is sort of the fertile part of Syria where crops and stuff are grown, and it's also an oil-rich region, particularly down around Dar el-Zor. The interesting thing is, whatever he says he's going to do in this 20-mile wide safe zone to resettle refugees, he's not done over in Afrin, which he took over, and nothing, from what I can see, nothing good has happened. Idlib there is still sort of a volatile area. The opposition to the Assad regime is seated there, and at some point, Russia and Assad are going to move in. There's a great article in the New York Times this morning talking about how hospitals, and they go through social media and charts and maps and everything. It's a very detailed article about how Russia and Assad have bombed hospitals around Syria. So, I see people talk about, the great Assad, he's just a nice guy. He's an eye doctor. I mean, how bad could he be? But the reality is somewhat different. And look, there's plenty of blame and bad people to go around. So Trump says, I'm pulling out. Erdogan starts moving in with troops, airstrikes, that sort of thing. This is Erdogan saying, this is when he's announcing this. I wish success to our operators, Spring and of Operation Peace Spring, kiss them on the forehead. I believe that together with the Syrian National Army, Turkish armed forces will achieve a big success against PKK, YPG, and Daesh. And so what Erdogan does is the narratives on this are just incredibly confusing. Everybody's all over the lot. People support the president, they don't support the president. What's going on? This is the editor of the Jerusalem Post saying they're abandoning allies. This is from March when people were evacuating an area in northern Syria when some other attacks were taking place. But this is what you see. The reports this morning are 200,000 people have been done. This is a lady said, I left my husband in Kobani and my child died on the way as we were evacuating, my 1-year-old child. Now, this is the problem. When you see this on Twitter and that type of thing, immediately what you see is a bunch of anti-Kurdish people will come in and say, that's Kurdish propaganda. So there were other reports, for example, that the Turks had bombed a base, had shot artillery or bombs near a base where there were American troops still. Turkey's now come out and say, well, it was a mistake. We were acting in self-defense against the Kurds. I mean, we invaded them and they responded, so we had to defend ourselves. You know, it's sort of remember those Menendez brothers that killed their parents? And then they went to get sentenced and they asked for mercy because they were orphans. Because my parents are dead. Well, you murdered them. So this is sort of the Erdogan version of that. So this is what's going on. And Putin's responded. He says, Assad has to take back northern Syria. So there's a big mess. Here are the tweets of Erdogan talking about how we're going to do this. We're going to eliminate the terrorist corridor. He says this, and this is a tweet, this is an actual translation of a tweet that he put up on October 9th. I accept all members of the Mohammedan army, heroes involved in the Peace Spring process from their foreheads, and I wish great success to them and all local supportive elements that stand side by side with Turkey in this process. God bless you. So listen, this is jihad. This is jihad. And so the other thing that he did was he came out, he gave a speech, I look on YouTube for Erdogan speeches and it's like, sit down and shut up already, because he's given a speech like every day to these big crowds and parliaments and all this stuff in Turkey. It's like every day. And sometimes it's multiple ones a day. But so he gave a speech. He was talking to the AKP party. And he says, look, we've started Operation Peace Spring, where our security forces are very heroic. We're taking back, this area of northern Syria. We're providing a safe zone. Our aim of Operation Peace Spring is to contribute to Syria's territorial integrity. This is, and then he says, hey, European Union. He actually said that, you can hear him in he said, hey, European Union, if you attempt to label our operations as an invasion, then it's simple. We will open our borders and send 3.6 million refugees your way. And so look, this is a big deal, what's going on. So you have people, like I said, 200,000 people have already fled. Just in the last few days have fled the Kurdish regions there in northern Syria. He's trying to split them off, the Arab people off. What Syria did, Putin and Assad, they purged Syria of the Sunni Muslims because Iran was coming in to take over. So there's all kinds of reaction. Richard Engel says this: Turkey conflict in Syria took a major turn today. First alleged atrocities by Turkish-backed militias executing Kurds. One of the people that was executed was this lady, who was a Kurdish politician. They got her in a car and they shot her in the head, killed her on the spot. She was not armed. It's Brett McGurk, who recently just resigned from the administration, says, listen, this is a war crime. And this is the UNICEF Act. This is a pro-Erdogan thing saying they don't say that they killed her or executed her. They say she was neutralized. So there's tremendous amount of propaganda. So what Erdogan does is he says all the Kurds are terrorists. The PKK is bad. And look, their PKK has been bad. They're Maoists. They're Marxists. They've done atrocities. They've been the Turkish region. They've been doing terrorist attacks and that type of thing. But not all Kurds are the same. But the Turkish propaganda narrative that all Kurds are the same and all Kurds are terrorists, I see it percolating throughout the mainstream media, all sorts of media. And it's just not true. UNICEF is a very pro-Erdogan mouthpiece. It's a website. And here, remember I used this about, I think it was a year ago, they came out with this thing about, all the Muslim countries ought to unite and attack Israel. And so when we see this, it's sort of like, well, that sort of sounds like an end times thing. And that's right, because it's not just the Shias that have their end times theology that they think they can bring about and their timing, but they also have, the Sunnis have the same thing. And Islamists like Erdogan think that they're the ones who are going to restore the Islamic Caliphate. So a lot of people displaced. The Arabs are like, wait a minute, you're attacking an Arab region. Iran's upset. Putin's upset. Syria's upset. So there are a couple views. I'm going to give you a couple views. Some say what Trump did was okay. Some say not. So here's I don't remember his name, Lieutenant Colonel, I want to say McGinnis on Tucker Carlson the other night, supporting what the president did and giving the reason why it's a smart move.
Doug McGregor is a retired U.S. Army colonel, author of the book Margin to Victory, and maybe the wisest voice on foreign policy that we know. And on nights like this, we're always grateful to have him. Colonel, what do you make of the response to the president's announcement?
Well, the swamp is clearly very disturbed because the president has done something that I have not witnessed in the last 30 years. He's actually injecting strategy back into American foreign and defense policy. Let me explain. He's turned to Mr. Erdogan, who has been trying to carve out a portion of Syria now for a very long time. Remember, Mr. Erdogan is also partially responsible for standing up ISIS. Then ISIS turned out to be a Frankenstein's monster, and he decided it needed to be brought under control. Now he wants to resettle Sunni Arab refugees in northwestern Syria and create a kind of security zone for Turkish interests. But he's also simultaneously told Mr. Erdogan, you can do this, but now you are responsible for dealing with ISIS if ISIS rears its head. If it comes back, it's your problem. Now, this is a very important point. The president has shifted the burden of responsibility for something that is clearly regional, clearly goes back to Turkey, to Mr. Erdogan. At the same time, Russia has promised to maintain the territorial integrity of Syria, come what may. How is Russia going to deal with Mr. Erdogan, who has decided to carve out a piece of Syria for his own purposes? And then we have Iran. Iran wants to maintain its connectivity to Lebanon and its Shiite allies in that country. But with the Turks dominating northern Syria, Iran now is going to be unable, or at least will find it far, far more difficult to connect with Lebanon. The point is the president has checkmated all of the key players in the region in Syria. Now they must confront each other for a change.
But wait a second, you're leaving out a key point, and the one that I've been hearing all day long on a loop on television, which is really our only allies in the world, the Kurds of Syria. What about them? Everybody on television basically spent 12 hours today in a kind of tribute to the Syrian Kurds.
Well, and that's part of that is that, and I think whatever McGregor said was good, is tempered by the fact that what the ISIS issue and the camps that involve, there's 70,000 women and children in an ISIS camp in Al-Hor in northeastern Syria. There are reports of this ISIS detainees escaping from prisons that are being held because the Kurds say, hey, you're not going to support us. We're not going to support these. We're not going to take care of these things. And Turkey hasn't come in to take things over. And there's a lot of questions as to whether Turkey's going to do anything with ISIS people anyway, given some of the things that happened in the past. So here's another contrary view.
Fox News senior strategic analyst, retired 4-star general Jack Keane. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
I've been anxious to talk to you about all this and get your perspective. What do you think?
Well, I'm frustrated like a lot of people are. This is so preventable. We were in negotiations with the Turks and the Kurds. We were doing joint patrol with Turkey military, U.S. military, Turkey military. The Kurds had moved back a lot of their fortifications right up on the border, but not all of them. And then the real negotiation was over how far is the buffer or safe zone going to be. Turkey wanted 20 miles, Kurds wanted 5. So there's disagreement over that. Erdogan was impatient, it's taken too long, etc. So that's where we were last week. And then all changed on Sunday as a result of a phone conversation.
Was this a shock? I mean,
everybody is shocked.
Yeah. I mean,
everybody is shocked,
and
particularly including our military on the ground who's involved in the negotiations and the Kurds as well. And why do I say it's preventable? Because when Erdogan presented the plan that I'm going to go in and establish that safe haven by force, we control the airspace in eastern Syria. At that point, we should have said to him, Mr. President, meaning Erdogan, we are not going to tolerate that. You bring any military across that border, we will retaliate. We're not going to stand for that.
because we control the airspace.
Yeah, you're going to suffer the consequences. What I want, Mr. Trump, what I want from you is let's continue our negotiations. That is the answer here.
But you need the military there to continue the negotiations.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's a contrary view. So this is what's going on all social media. Trump's an idiot. Trump's the brilliant chess master. I do agree with the first thing guy on Tucker Carlson that it has sort of put Russia, Iran, and Turkey, we always talk about this alliance that's forming in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and I've cautioned that, there's sort of an alliance there, but they have competing interests, and what Trump did has sort of enlarged the gap in their competing interests. So in that respect, I think it's actually a pretty important move, but we worked with the Kurds for a long time, trained them to fight ISIS and that type of thing, and the General Keane there makes the point that we're not really fighting a war like we were. We don't have 150,000 troops like we did in Iraq. We don't have 130,000 in Afghanistan. We have a couple thousand in Syria, training people and letting them doing the fighting and training them to some respect. So the next person I'm going to play is Jonathan Spire, who lives in Israel. He's from Great Britain. He's really one of the better foreign policy analysts. He's written a book about the fall of Syria after the fall, and quite a good writer, articulate speaker. So he was interviewed on I-24 News the other night.
Jonathan, let's talk for a moment about really the people and the fighters, militants, whatever you want to call them, at the center of this, the Kurds. What do you think this operation, now only in its second day, is ultimately going to mean for them?
Well, it very much depends on the extent to which the Turks wish and indeed prove able to push this. If we go by the outline given by President Erdogan in his speech to the UN General Assembly, where he was talking about a 30-mile deep so-called security zone stretching along the entirety of the border. Now, if that is the real intention of the Turks, and if the Turkish armed forces and their Syrian, Arab and Islamist allies try to implement that, then that has very grave implications indeed for the Kurdish population of northern Syria, because that area which they'll be trying to push into, the Turks, is the area where the majority of the Syrian Kurdish population is resident. So I'm afraid if the Turks do intend to try to push towards that objective, there is the real possibility of a very large movement of Kurdish population. When the Turks destroyed the Afrin enclave, northwest Syria, in the beginning of 2018, fully 200,000 Kurdish Syrians were on the move from that area. Today we're talking about a population of nearly 1 million people in that area, and there's a real possibility, if the Turkish army and their Sunni Islamist Syrian allies enter that area, that there could be a very large-scale exit, so to speak, and displacement of the Syrian Kurdish population. And that, I think, is the central fear, so to speak, from the Syrian Kurdish point of view.
Right, and Jonathan, a strong statement today from Prime Minister Netanyahu. What is the Israeli interest here?
Well, the Israeli interest is very clear. The fact of the matter is that that area today, and it's around 30% of the territory of Syria, is a kind of de facto American/Kurdish protectorate. And it forms a land barrier against the possibility of Iranian encroachment, the famous Iranian land bridge from east to west. It's not a 100% sealed barrier, because right down to the south there's a place called Abu Kamal, where the Iranians have a crossing. But the greater part of the territory stops the Iranians from using it because the Americans and the Kurds are there. Now, if the Turks push in from the north, there is a real possibility, if that really looks like a genuine possibility of them taking that whole area, that the Kurds could turn back to the Assad regime and the Russians and invite them to come east to the Euphrates, with the possibility that what could end up here is a kind of Turkish/Sunni Islamist enclave in the north, and then a regime/Iranian enclave in the south. That would be very, very bad from an Israeli point of view, because it would directly strengthen the Iranian goal of building that land bridge. So that's.
And Netanyahu, he gave a speech the other day, and he said, listen, we understand this is a problem. He was not critical of President Trump, but he said, look, Israel, this was the Yom Kippur this week, and it was they remembered the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when an American president who was under threat of impeachment at that time stepped up and helped Israel in that war by sending some supplies that they needed, without which the Israeli state would have maybe not survived. So one other article that I would highly recommend, Seth Frantzman, this is sort of an excerpt of his book, After ISIS. He's one of the editors at the Jerusalem Post. Turkey's war in Syria was not inevitable, and this is sort of an excerpt from his book, but updated to include things about what's been going on this week. And Seth is a very good analyst of what's going on in the Middle East. And so he says, look, this is a big problem. Western countries aren't going to do more in Syria. They proved that over and over throughout the Syrian civil war. Nearby countries like Turkey and Iran will do more, and with a clear vision of what they want. And whereas we do things based on the next election cycle, Turkey and Iran, they're looking sometimes a couple of generations ahead. They'd like to get everything now, but if it happens in a couple of generations, they don't care as much. They're planning for it. And then Turkey appears drunk on nationalism amid its ever-expanding wars in northern Syria. These are some quotes from Seth's article. And so I highly recommend it. That's at Foreign Policy magazine, and you can look that up. So another article by Seth this week in the Jerusalem Post, Turkey rewrites international law with safe zone invasion doctrine. And the answer to the question that Seth asked there is, well, what does this mean for foreign policy worldwide? They're going to do this in Africa. They're going to do this in India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia. Create somebody says, well, I can create a safe zone. So how does that all play out? So this is, I think it's a big deal. And so I'm going to finish with that today. But what I would like you to do, and I'll talk more about it next week as we watch this unfold. The answer is we don't know exactly what President Trump did or not. We know that there are atrocities being committed. You can find videos on Twitter of Kurdish people being, with their hands tied behind their back, being summarily executed on the road. I mean, this is happening. That the Kurdish politician who had tried to work with getting Muslims and Christians together, she was summarily executed last night. So there are atrocities being committed as we speak. There are Christians in Kurdistan, in the Kurdish regions there of Syria and Iraq and Iran. You need to pray for them. There are vehicles that you can do to support them, but this is a big deal. I would encourage you to go home, and I don't have time to go into it today. Daniel chapter 8. Some people say it's past, it's already been fulfilled prophecy. I'm not so sure. I'm open to the possibility, maybe the probability that it's yet future, that there's a fulfillment of it that will be more precise than we say in the past historically when, Alexander came in and took over that region. I do think that it could prophesy a conflict between Iran and Turkey. So that's, I think, the big deal from a Bible prophecy standpoint, that if that is a prophecy that's going to be fulfilled, we sort of see how that might come about. And the funny thing is, 2 weeks ago, nobody really was talking about this. And it just goes to show that things change very, very rapidly in our world. There is a convergence and a speed and acceleration with which things are happening. We see it on the religious side, we see it culturally, we see it geopolitically, and it's all happening at the same time. And it's not something we should worry about. If you're a child of God, it'll work out okay for you, really. And I think Dr. Cooper's, one of the answers on the panel yesterday was, get a Bible, get a real Bible, and read it, and do what it says. Because it is sufficient for all matters of faith and practice, and we really need to act on that. But so go look up Daniel chapter 8, because I think it's a very important passage, and we will just see, here was an attack on a synagogue, near a synagogue on Yom Kippur in Germany. This is something we see happening with greater frequency. So look, it's an exciting time to be alive. I remember Jesus, when he was talking to his disciples, said that, guys, the people long to live for the days that you're living in. And so if we believe the Lord's going to return, we ought to long for his return. And praise the Lord that we're alive to see these things unfold and happen. So I don't know how quickly it's going to happen, but certainly a lot more things happened this week than were happening last Sunday. And this seems to be the usual thing that I say. So let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word, for the comfort and the strength that we get from feeding on it. Guide us by your Spirit. Give us wisdom, strength, and power, and give us opportunities to share with others the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ, the only hope for salvation from our sins and for peace in this world. Bless us this week in Jesus' name. Amen.